Fighting for Earth. Today I'm going to talk about a radical idea, going to war against those countries that are the worst emitters in order to stop climate change. But before talking about the philosophical theories about war and their application to the idea of such an environmental war, let me first address pacifism, which is the belief that war is never morally permissible. Naturally, if pacifism were correct, going to war for any reason would be morally wrong, no matter what the objectives and consequences of the war in question are. So if pacifism is correct, it would be wrong to go to war even to save the earth and ourselves from an environmental disaster. One influential argument for pacifism is as follows. Innocents are injured or killed in war. Injuring or killing innocents is never morally permissible. Therefore, war is never morally permissible. The first premise of the argument is undeniably true. The question then is whether the second premise is true or not. Here's an objection to it. In some situations, injuring or killing innocents is necessary to prevent more serious injuries to innocents or greater numbers of innocent deaths. Some wars might be similarly necessary. That's why it's hard to agree with this argument for pacifism. In any case, pacifists tend to have a tough time answering this question. Are all wars morally the same? Is a war waged to commit genocide the same as a war waged to stop genocide? They are clearly not the same, morally speaking, so I suggest that we set aside pacifism at least for the time being and explore the moral landscape of war. Theories of just war aim to do just that. They are ideas about when war is morally permissible. In this context, the word just is used as a synonym for morally permissible. There are three prominent theories of just war. These are utilitarianism, contractualism, and deontology. Let's start with utilitarianism. As you might remember from the lecture about the basic concepts of environmental ethics, utilitarianism is a version of consequentialism. According to utilitarianism, the morally correct action is the one that maximizes the net balance of happiness. On this view, war is just when it will lead to more net happiness than peace. Although it is somewhat popular, there are problems with utilitarianism and its application to the moral permissibility of war. First, the future is awfully hard to predict. This is the cover page of one of my favorite books, The Year 2000. It's a book written in the 1960s by two prominent scientists who tried to predict what the world will be like in the year 2000. The authors of the book failed miserably. They predicted that fusion power will be abundant and replace fossil fuels. They couldn't think of fracking. They thought we would have computers the size of football fields, but they couldn't predict the internet, mobile computation, or computer viruses. They thought that lasers will be the weapons of the future, but they didn't think about laser eye surgery or using a laser to read digital information from a disk. And in the book, there is no mention of climate change whatsoever. I like this book because reading it is a humbling experience. It shows that even the smartest experts are clueless when it comes to predicting what will happen in just a half human lifespan from now. Since utilitarians try to judge the moral status of an action based on all of its future consequences, they are also very prone to error. Besides, happiness, like any feeling, is difficult to quantify. We still try, of course, but it is hard to put a number on something that is inherently subjective. Suppose that someone asks you how happy you are and tell you to rate it from 1 to 10. You think about it and say 7. They ask me the same question and I also say 7. But we can't know whether your 7 is comparable to my 7. Maybe your 7 is better than anything I can even imagine. Maybe my 7 is worse than your worst nightmare. Since we can't be in each other's heads, we can't know. Since we can't know how your happiness or misery compares to mine, trying to add them up is inherently like trying to compare apples and oranges. In other words, there is a serious conceptual difficulty underlying the idea of calculating a net balance of happiness. Finally, utilitarianism seems to condone injustice. For instance, is it just to injure or kill innocents to increase the net balance of happiness? If that sounded too abstract, let's think about a racist society in which a small minority is hated by the majority so much they are hunted for sport. Each month, a random individual among the minority is selected, tracked, and gunned down by professional manhunters. The whole ordeal is streamed on Twitch or whatever the cool kids are watching in that society. Almost everyone has a grand old time. Of course, the victim and his family feel immense fear and suffering, but that's greatly outweighed by the joy the mainstream audience experiences. What would utilitarianism say about that? It would have to say, if it is gonna make almost everyone happy, hunting human beings for racist enjoyment is morally right. I take that answer to be a refutation of utilitarianism. But maybe I'm being too uncharitable here. If you disagree with me, please let me know what you think. Then there's contractualism. According to contractualism, the morally correct action is the one that is mandated by enforceable contracts. On this view, a nation going to war is just when it is mandated by an enforceable contract, that is, an international pact or alliance. Germany declaring war on Russia in World War I was just according to contractualism because Germany was in an alliance with its neighbor Austria, and the conditions of the alliance provisioned that if Russia attacks Austria, Germany will join the war to defend her ally. But in World War II, Germany declaring war on the Soviet Union was unjust because at that time, Germany had no contractual obligation to attack them. Again, there are problems, of course. For instance, what about evil alliances and pacts made for malicious reasons? For instance, Italy made an agreement with Germany that required them to join a war against the Soviet Union. Why? Not because the Soviet Union did anything to hurt or threaten Italy. It was just that the leader of Italy at the time, Benito Mussolini, had an ideologically driven hatred of the Soviet Union and wanted it to be destroyed, just like Hitler did. So the two friends got together and agreed to attack the Soviet Union. But the fact that there is such a contract signed by the heads of state doesn't make it just. Like utilitarianism, contractualism also condones injustice. Here's why. Most citizens don't consent to risking their lives at war. International pacts obligate citizens to risk their lives at war. Contracts are unjust when they obligate non-consenting parties. Therefore, international pacts that obligate nations to engage in war are unjust. Which means, by equating what those contracts say with what morality requires, contractualism condones injustice. Here, the interesting premise is premise 3, because the other two are just empirical facts. Why would anyone believe premise 3? Here's a reason by analogy. Imagine that I sign a lease agreement with my landlady which says, if I fail to pay my rent, you will have to pay it. You didn't sign the contract. My landlady and I signed it. Now, is this contract just? Is obligating you to pay my rent just if you never agreed to it? I would say no. Similarly, neither I nor anyone in my audience ever signed an international agreement. The chances are you haven't even read an international agreement. Take the North Atlantic Treaty, which founded NATO, for example. Have you ever agreed to risk your life by fighting a war if Russia invades Slovakia? I didn't. The chances are, nor did you. But that's precisely what you might be obligated to do if you're a draft-age man in the United States. So we can't justify risking your life based on a document signed by politicians in Slovakia and the United States any more than we can justify forcing you to pay my rent based on an agreement between me and my landlady. But even if you aren't crazy about these moralistic criticisms, you should be still worried about the real-world consequences of contractualism. Contractualism as an ideology encourages opportunistic expansionism and aggressive wars. Nation-states use it as a pretext for terrible actions. For instance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 led to the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union jointly invading and carving up Poland and murdering 17% of its population, mostly civilians. It gets worse. When commonly accepted as the basis of international law, contractualism leads to the creation of opposing blocs of nations and encourages global wars, such as the First World War, which killed nearly 20 million people, most of them young like you. If you are historically inclined, I recommend this terrifying but wonderful book by Barbara Tuchman, which masterfully documents how the Europeans' faith in the moral power of international contracts led the world into disaster. Finally, there is deontology, which is currently the dominant view among philosophers and jurists of international law. Trying not to repeat their mistakes, deontologists made their theory quite a bit more nuanced than utilitarianism and contractualism. Indeed, the question, what makes war just, contains two separate questions which are confused with each other by utilitarians and contractualists. The first one is, what makes the decision to go to war just? The second question is, what makes the conduct of war just? The one on the left, which we will focus on, is sometimes called jus et bellum, because the origins of the deontic theory of just war goes all the way back to early Catholic philosophers such as St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who wrote in Latin. The question on the right also has a Latin name, jus in bello. These are the conditions of jus et bellum. According to deontology, for a decision to go to war to be just, all 6 of these conditions must be satisfied. And these 3 are the conditions of jus in bello. The author of the reading for today, Adam Betts, talks a little bit about jus in bello, but his main focus is on jus et bellum. That's why I will focus on jus et bellum exclusively and ignore jus in bello. So these are the conditions of jus et bellum. Now let's look at each one closely. Legitimate authority concerns legitimacy of political authority. The decision to start or enter a war must be made by a legitimate political authority. The natural question to ask in this context, of course, is what makes a political authority legitimate? Back in the day when St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas were thinking about just war, the common answer was divine right, a God-given mandate to rule. On this view, God would choose someone, who was typically the son of someone else he had chosen previously, and give that someone the authority to rule by decree a certain geographic region and its inhabitants. Of course, God hasn't been available for an interview for some time. So the Catholic Church and its CEO helpfully told everyone who God made the legitimate political authority whenever there was any doubt. Then a bunch of people in the 18th century, France and North America, decided that divine right is a stupid way of determining who has the right to rule. They had a different idea. The authority should be chosen, not by God, but by the people. As you know, we still have this idea, at least over here in the Western world. But there's also a third idea about the source of legitimacy of political authority. It is the rule of law. For instance, in the United States, by law, only Congress has the authority to declare war. Even if a president were immensely popular, he or she cannot go to war without Congress's approval. Doing so would be unjust because it would be trespassing the limits of the law. Today, only the last 2 are recognized by international law as sources of political legitimacy. What does that mean for the purpose of the question, what makes going to war just? It means this: going to war is just only if the decision to go to war was made by a person or entity that has either democratic support or the legal authority to go to war, and perhaps both. For instance, a terrorist organization initiating war would be unjust. Then there's the just cause condition. For the decision to go to war to be just, there must be a just cause for war. But what exactly is a just cause for war? International law recognizes a number of reasons as just causes for war. First, there is humanitarian intervention. For instance, in 1992, the United States and its allies declared war on Serbia to stop its genocide against Bosnian Muslims. According to international law, this was a war with a just cause because there was a humanitarian crisis that called for military action. Then there is the recovery of unjustly lost or occupied territory. A real-world example of this is Israel's illegal expansion beyond its internationally recognized 1967 borders. Other countries in the region, such as Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, all lost territory to Israel during Israel's expansionist wars of aggression. Some think that this constitutes a just cause to wage war against Israel to recover those territories. Then there is self-defense against attacks and threats. The most obvious form of self-defense is retaliation against an attack that has already happened. For instance, the United States' entry to World War II after the attack against Pearl Harbor is an instance of retaliation. International law unsurprisingly recognizes this as a just cause to wage war against Japan. Another form of self-defense that is recognized as a just cause is when a country faces an imminent threat, such as an attack that is about to happen. This is called preemption or preemptive war. An example of this is Israel's preemptive attack against Egypt in 1967, which started the Six-Day War. This is how it happened. Israeli military intelligence received evidence that Egypt was about to launch a surprise attack against Israel. The threat was imminent. Egyptian troops were amassing along the border. So Israel acted first and preemptively launched its own attack against Egypt. According to international law, Israel had just cause to launch this attack because there was an imminent threat. International law also identifies things that do not constitute a just cause, such as territorial expansion. Going to war for territorial expansion is unjust, as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union did in 1939 when they partitioned Poland, and Israel has been arguably doing since 1967. The most recent example of such a war, however, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. As Russia's president acknowledged himself, one of his reasons for this war was to bring Ukrainian territory back under the control of Russian Federation, which he sees as a continuation of the Soviet Union. Colonial wars are also considered unjust. For instance, today's international law would characterize Great Britain's war against the 13 colonies to keep them under control as unjust. Going to war for resources is also unjust. An example of this is Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which was for Kuwait's rich oil reserves. Another unjust cause is ethnic or religious cleansing. Again, Nazi Germany's invasion of Eastern Europe is an example of such an unjust war. What Germany did was unjust in part because the motivation was to exterminate a large part of the Eastern European population. This idea is known as the Hunger Plan, which aimed to starve to death about 50 million Eastern Europeans in slave labor camps to make room for German colonists. Indeed, the Holocaust was a small and kind of rushed part of this plan. Nazis started killing large numbers of civilians with poison gas in 1942 and 1943, only after it became clear that they won't be able to hold on to Eastern Europe long enough to starve most of its population to death. Finally, there's prevention, which is a defensive war against a distant threat. Arguably, the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a preventive war because the official rationale for war was to stop Iraq from developing nuclear weapons. Crucially, even US intelligence sources thought that Iraq was at least 2 years away from the bomb. Of course, even this prediction turned out to be false. No weapons development program was found despite extensive searches by the US government after the invasion. So there was no imminent threat. The threat the US government at the time alleged was a distant threat, at least 2 years away, probably even further. Notice the difference between preemption, which defends against imminent threats, and prevention, which defends against distant threats. International law recognizes preemption as a just cause, but there is a big debate about whether prevention can constitute a just cause. The United States and a few of its allies, such as United Kingdom and Israel, think that prevention can constitute just cause for war. The rest of the Western world and the United Nations Charter are explicitly against preventive wars. I'm saying all this for two reasons. First, I want to help you understand why the United States has such a bad reputation in Europe nowadays. Unfortunately, because of our preventive invasion of Iraq, we are seen as a country waging wars of aggression. Second, and more importantly, Adam Betts, the author of today's reading, is one of those people who think that prevention can constitute a just cause, at least as far as environmental wars are concerned. We are going to come back to this in a bit and discuss whether prevention can be just or not. The important thing to remember for now is the material difference between preemption and prevention. The former implies an imminent threat. The latter implies a distant threat. Next, there is the right intention requirement. To go to war justly, our reasons for going to war must match a just cause. The United States invading Iraq in 2003 is again a good illustration of this condition. As I said, the US government's stated reason for invading Iraq was the worry that Iraq was developing nuclear weapons. One possibility is that this was an honest attempt to keep us safe from a rogue state. There is also another, and perhaps more popular theory. The threat of Iraq acquiring nukes was just a pretext for waging a war. The real reason for the war was securing Iraqi oil reserves. If the theory on the left is correct, the US might have satisfied the right intention condition because our reasons for war matched a possible just cause. If the theory on the right is correct, however, the United States failed the right intention condition because although there might have been a just cause, the real reasons for war had nothing to do with that just cause. The just cause was merely an excuse. Next, there's the proportionality of ends. This condition requires that the just cause for war must not be outweighed by considerations against war. For instance, if going to war against a country such as Russia will trigger nuclear retaliation, it would be unjust, even if there is a just cause for war, such as stopping Russia from expanding by force. Next, there is the hope of success condition. There must be reasonable hope of success to achieve the strategic objectives contained in a just cause. According to some, NATO continuing to fight in Afghanistan or intervening in Syria would be unjust because these wars are arguably unwinnable. There is no hope of success. Due to historical and cultural factors, a significant portion of the Syrian and Afghani populations are too hostile to the West. They will never stop fighting until NATO leaves, which is precisely what happened in Afghanistan in 2021. And finally, there's the last resort condition, which is also known as necessity. Last resort requires that all reasonable nonviolent means must be fully explored before war. Once again, the United States invading Iraq in 2003 is a good example. Let's suppose the administration at the time was honest. They sincerely believed that they were going to war for their stated reason. Iraq was developing nuclear weapons. As I said earlier, however, by their own estimates, there was still time to exert pressure on Iraq and force a disarmament like the one that happened in Iran when Obama administration forced them to stop their nuclear weapons development program. But the Bush administration didn't want to negotiate or apply pressure. They wanted to go to war without any delay. Therefore, they arguably failed their last resort requirement. I know it all sounds complicated, but the upshot of all of this is really simple. According to the deontic theory of just war and the international law built on it, the decision to go to war is just only if it satisfies all 6 of these conditions. If it fails even one of them, it's an unjust war. And the more conditions a decision fails, the more unjust the resulting war is. I'm grateful for all your patience thus far because it was a long introduction. But now we are ready to tackle the interesting environmental ethics question. According to the deontic theory of just war and international law, would it be just to wage war against a country that is refusing to lower their greenhouse gas emissions? Thanks to that long introduction, we know how to answer this question. We just go through all 6 conditions and try to figure out whether or not such an environmental war could satisfy each and every condition. First, there is legitimate authority. Since this condition requires democratic or legal basis for the decision, it rules out eco-terrorist organizations. If an environmental war is to be just, it needs to be waged by states or coalitions of states. Next, there is the just cause condition. This could also be satisfied in principle. Indeed, often people argue that we owe taking drastic action against climate change to future generations. So perhaps that drastic action can be war against countries that contribute to climate change. Here's an argument to that effect. Protecting future humans from great harm by climate change constitutes a just cause. An environmental war against countries that don't reduce their emissions would protect future humans from great harm by climate change. Therefore, an environmental war against countries that don't reduce their emissions would have a just cause. Let's call this argument the pro-war argument. One thing to notice about the pro-war argument is that it is framed in individualistic and anthropocentric terms. The just cause for war is protecting future humans as opposed to the ecosystem as a whole. As you will see later, this will prove important. But before we get to that, there are other complications that push against the pro-war argument. The first complication is the non-identity problem. The non-identity problem rears its head in all sorts of places in ethics and political philosophy, and it can be hard to grasp without seeing an example of it. That's why instead of defining the problem first, I will start with an argument based on it, which goes like this. If a successful environmental war is waged, the future will be altered and different humans will exist. So humans who will be greatly harmed by climate change will exist only if we don't wage a successful environmental war. But one cannot harm a person by bringing her into existence. Therefore, an environmental war against countries that don't reduce their emissions will lack a just cause. And let's call this argument the anti-war argument. To understand why the first 2 premises of the anti-war argument are true, we should think about our choices and their long-term effects. Think about what we choose to do now and what the consequences of those choices will be by, let's say, year 2100, the time by which the worst effects of global warming might materialize. Let's focus on the choice about the kind of environmental war Betts is interested in. Our first option is not going to war. Let's assume that will lead to substantial warming of the planet. Billions will be turned into refugees. One such refugee is Maya, who will be born in year 2092 in a refugee camp somewhere in East Asia. Her parents, who were factory workers once, became unemployed due to economic collapse and met in that camp where Maya was later born. Maya's life will be nasty, brutish, and short. Because of worldwide crop failures, let's say she will die from tuberculosis caused by malnutrition at age 9. Of course, I'm making this all up. But assuming the worst case scenarios of climate change will come true, something like that will happen to someone around that time frame. Our second option is to go to war to save the earth and humanity from such a disaster. Let's assume, for the time being, the war is a complete success. And we don't just prevent the worst case scenarios, we turn the environment around and create a completely sustainable and prosperous green global economy. Maya will never be born in that timeline because her parents will never become refugees. Instead, They will either not exist themselves or they will meet other people, and let's say one of them will have another kid named Lee. Lee will have a long and wonderful life, largely thanks to humanity's hard-earned ability to live in harmony with nature. Now you can see why the anti-war argument claims that if a successful environmental war is waged, the future will be altered and different humans will exist. If we don't go to war to save the earth, Lee will never exist. If we go to war, Maya will never exist. Let's focus on Maya. She is one of the people who will live and die in the dystopia created by global warming. If we decide not to go to war, will she be harmed by that decision? That would be an odd thing to say. Although she will not be harmed by global warming if we go to war now, she won't exist either. Claiming that she will be saved from harm by making her not exist would be a bit like saying that you can cure a headache by chopping someone's head off. And the claim that she will be harmed by our decision not to go to war sounds also a bit absurd, because that decision is the only way she can exist. And that's the logic behind the third premise of the anti-war argument. One cannot harm a person by bringing her into existence. What I have just described is the non-identity problem. The existence of people like Maya is unavoidably flawed. The only alternative to bringing such people into existence is to bring another person like Lee into existence instead. But if existence is worth having, and no one else's interests are at stake, it's unclear on what ground morality would insist that the choice to bring Maya into her flawed existence is morally wrong. What I gave you was a very compressed summary of the non-identity problem, which has an entire subliterature of ethics dedicated to it. In case you want to learn more about it, I'm linking a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry about it in the video description. But long story short, here is the import of the non-identity problem. The rhetoric of saving the future generations of humans from harm is misguided. We cannot justify any current action against climate change on the rights of future persons, because if the action is successful, those future persons will not exist. Therefore, saving them from harm cannot constitute a just cause for an environmental war to stop global warming. As stated earlier, however, there is a limitation to the application of the non-identity problem here. It is responding to an individualistic and anthropocentrist pro-war argument. What if we took the pro-war argument and made it ecocentric and holistic? Then the non-identity problem won't apply, because the ecosystem will continue to exist in some shape or form whether we go to war or not, and our decision not to go to war can conceivably harm it. So, the non-identity problem can be avoided if we base our claim for a just cause on the desire to protect the whole ecosystem rather than individual future humans. Still, even the modified pro-war argument runs into a further complication. The second complication is due to the time frame of the threat. Worst-case scenarios of climate change do not pose an imminent threat. So such a war would currently be a preventive war, not a preemptive war. And as I said earlier, the international community and philosophers are divided over the issue whether preventive wars can be just. Betts is among those who believe that preventive environmental wars can be just, at least in principle. He used an analogy to defend his belief that prevention can be just. The analogy involves a dam, which is slowly damaged by the industrial activity in a neighboring country. If the dam breaks, it will cause a massive flood in our country. But the threat is not imminent. Our engineers say that it will take several years until the dam is damaged enough to break. Should we wait around until the flood is imminent? Or do we have a right to strike preventively and coerce our neighbors to stop damaging our dam? In parallel to that, should we consider saving the planet from a disaster in the long term a just cause? Next, there's the right intention condition. This condition requires that our reasons for waging an environmental war must be environmental. Preventing climate change cannot be just a pretext for war. I'm a bit worried about this one because climate change is the perfect excuse for the United States and other Western countries to turn hostile towards China and India. It will be hard to satisfy it. Then there is a proportionality of ends, which requires a just cause of stopping climate change not to be outweighed by the cost of war. Here, I'm not talking about only the financial and material cost of war. A war between NATO and China would inevitably cause massive loss of human lives, probably on both sides. Is climate change serious enough to justify losses at such scale? A related condition is the hope of success, which requires an environmental war to have the hope of substantially curbing climate change. But wars themselves cause massive environmental damage, including large emissions. A war between industrialized nations is unlikely to reduce global net emissions. Such a war would probably make the problem worse, not better. Last, there's the last resort condition, which requires a war to be necessary to achieve the desired end. On this one, Betts argues that there is still time and room for nonviolent pressure against non-compliant parties. For instance, Betts thinks that governments around the world can continue to negotiate peacefully as they have been doing in various recent climate conferences. If that doesn't work, we can resort to soft war tactics such as propaganda, cyber warfare, and economic pressure against the non-compliant governments. And finally, Betts thinks that we can resort to jus ad vim tactics. Jus ad vim, by the way, are a set of moral principles that govern limited use of force that falls short of war, such as no-fly zones, blockades, and targeted killings. In a nutshell, Betts thinks that an environmental war to stop climate change could be a just war, at least in principle. However, primarily because we have time to try other tactics to force everyone to reduce their net zero emissions, such a war wouldn't be just right now. I know there's a lot to absorb and think about here, but I would like to hear what you think about Betts' assessment of preventive environmental wars. This brings me to the end of this lecture. Send me a message if you have any questions. Thank you for your patience, and I'll catch you next time.